Dresner on my right, and Steve Moore is sitting over in the back over here. We're American political consultants who have been involved in the presidential campaign in Russia for the last 4.5 months. You've all hopefully have a copy of the release here. Does everybody have it? So I won't go through it again. I'll just add to it by saying that somewhere about a month ago, Time magazine found us and started doing a piece, an investigative piece, and we agreed to cooperate with them because we wanted to keep this out of the press until after the election. And out of that came a 4-week piece on that you see here, which was actually an effort where we provided Time magazine memos as we did them, and they were able to come and watch us interact in our office with campaign people and watch us see the results of what we did. So it was really fun for us and exciting. It was one of the experience of a lifetime for all of us, that's for sure. And so we just thought we'd be here, and we're happy and pleased and excited to finally be able to tell the story. And so we're just be open to your questions.
This morning alleging that basically you're promoting yourselves through this, and in fact you had very little influence in this campaign. But do you feel you played a role?
Well, the problem with the New York Times piece, first of all, is she never talked to us at all, and in spite of the fact we were giving interviews yesterday and we called her office. If she had, she would have found out that this wasn't an interview in Time magazine, as she called it. This was a 4-week investigative piece, and we didn't seek out Time magazine, they found us. The Washington Post found us. We didn't find the Washington Post, and we actually hung up on them, as was recorded in their paper, and the BBC found us. We didn't find them. So yeah, I mean, she's quoting the Kremlin line, and I don't think she would be quite so uncritically quoting the White House line if she was doing it over here. She's quoting people who a week ago were vociferously denying our very existence. So what the difference is in Mike Kramer's piece is that he's quoting some of those people before there was a Kremlin line and getting their offhand and honest reactions. And he was there and saw what happened.
And I think in terms of our role, obviously we... Oh, I'm sorry. In terms of our role, we're not claiming credit for making everything happen here. And in terms of the description of our role, I think that Time magazine and ABC and the Washington Post all explored this for themselves in Time for well over a month. And they came to these conclusions, you know, and so I don't think the New York Times put in the same kind of work, and they simply took the statements that some people who, as George said, a week ago were denying that we ever existed, that we were in Russia to begin with.
Yeah.
Could you just sum up why you had this success and Yeltsin? What were the factors in your opinion?
Yeah. Well, I think the factors were coming across with a clear message. And repeating the message. The first and most important thing I think we did was convince President Yeltsin that what he needed to do was get out and campaign in Western-style campaigning. And by Western-style campaigning, we mean get out of Moscow, go out and be among the people and do what we unabashedly admit are photo ops. You know, prior to that, they were giving speeches. The debate we had over the kickoff speech was they were talking about a 4-hour speech when we got there, which is the typical Soviet fashion, and we're telling them, you know, that just doesn't work. So the first thing was convincing them to be a Western-style campaigner. The second thing was there was a great resistance in the campaign to an anti-communist message. There was a lot of people who said that because of the success the communists had had in Poland and Hungary, and because of the growing nostalgia in Russia for Joseph Stalin, that an anti-communist campaign would not work. And in fact, the theme when we arrived was, as expressed in the kickoff speech, was around family values. Now, by family values, they don't mean exactly the same thing we mean. Certainly, pornography on television was part of it, but it was a philosophical argument about who should be making decisions, the family or the government. So we had to go to the mat to convince them that anti-communism was the way to go. And we feel strongly that if the communists had been allowed to paint themselves with a kinder and gentler face, that they would have likely won the election. The third theme that we came up with, which was persuasive, was a theme which revolved around the concern that many Russians had about civil unrest and even civil war that might ensue if the communists took over. The communists were reported to have armed bands and even admitted it in saying they had disbanded their armed bands. So there was a substantial portion of the population which, whether they supported the communists or supported the Democrats, mainly they wanted stability. And so we asked the president to address that, and he did so. So I would say the three important contributions we made was to get him on message and the three different messages, and I think that the results bore out.
How would you compare this campaign to American ones in addition?
Did you want to add to that question?
I just wanted to add 1 second on the message part, the anti-communist. The reality was that the Russian people recognized it and knew it to be true. So we created, I shouldn't say created, the message was something that they understood and responded to.
Yeah, you want to compare this to an American campaign? You want to do it, Dick, or you want me to do it?
Go ahead.
Well, I think a lot of it was the same. And one of the other biases the campaign had when we got there was that they had the bias that paid political advertising did not work. They constantly cited the example of the Duma elections, the recent Duma elections, and showed the fact that the people who spent the most on paid TV advertising did the poorest. So what we did was go out and get a copy of all the ads that were run in the Duma election and reviewed them for ourselves. And the amazing thing we found out was that while many of them were very clever and witty and creative, none of them made a point. And, you know, political ads have to be very serious in a country which has serious problems. And believe me, Russia, with a 50% decline in its gross domestic product, has a serious problem. So we felt that their ads were simply bad, not that they didn't work. So we had to convince them to do TV ads and make a very serious effort about it. I guess that's not a difference so much as a similarity, is that TV ads work there and they work here. Also, the similarity is that the presidential campaign here and there is both driven largely by the words that come out of the president's mouth. And certainly President Yeltsin drove the free coverage by staying on message, which is a similarity. A huge difference, and this will be no news to you, is that the free press over there was pretty much in lockstep in the Yeltsin campaign. We freely admit that, and supported Yeltsin in a fairly biased way that we wouldn't expect to find here in America under any circumstances or conditions.
I think I'd want to add two things, really. One is that when you look at the media, I mean, we're looking at the end of the process now, and everyone is saying, well, they jumped whole hog because they were state control into the Yeltsin campaign. When we got there, I would say that the bulk of the Moscow and St. Petersburg media were probably rooting for Gregory Yavlinsky, and they were bashing Yeltsin from day one into 6 or 7 weeks into the campaign. I think the second thing is that while the techniques have worked, a lot of the things that they did, particularly the basic getting down to people kind of campaigning, were not only a first in the democratic process there, but they were to some extent a first ever in Russian history. You don't have the leaders of Russia have always been aloof and apart from the people. This was a brand new and unique kind of experience, I think.
Yeah.
Could you tell me what, if any, role contact with Dick Morris played in this campaign? I understand there was some contact with him during the course of the campaign, and then you have the Times story about the Clinton-Yeltsin meeting as a means of beefing up Yeltsin's position.
I talk to Dick Morris a lot because he's a friend and a former partner, but I'm not prepared to make any comments on what we discussed in terms of this campaign at this point.
Can you guys speak Russian?
No.
Well, Alan, we had two of the people who worked with us. I mean, Alan Brainen, who was served as our translator, who's an American. He was our translator we brought from the United States, and so he worked for us directly. And then his father, who helped us get involved in the campaign, obviously spoke Russian fluently. And one of the key things they did for us, the translations went through this process. We'd write something in English, it would be translated into Russian, and then normally Alan would go through this very carefully to make sure that the Russian translation conveyed the English and American meaning that we're trying to get across.
When we first got there, there was a real problem of having to understand that you just couldn't have literal translation, but we had to make sure people understood the concepts, which actually was sort of funny over time. Like George had pointed out to me, there is no Russian word for privacy, there's no Russian word for message, and here we were talking about you've got to stay on message, and it gets translated into Russian, and it's nowhere near what you might think.
Did you produce the ads yourselves, I mean, as far as doing the creativity, the imagery, or did you use Russian filmmakers, and how did that process work for you?
The campaign hired Video International, which is an ad agency, and they were in Moscow, and they were responsible for the production. And the first set of commercials that were done in the first round had basically been produced at the point that we were introduced to the agency. I mean, they are tremendously creative people. We helped them target their message because up to that point, the campaign, in typical fashion, had deprived them of any research or any focus groups that were done specifically on the campaign. They were working from research that might have been done for selling dog food, and information about the campaign was tacked on to the end of it. So we worked cooperatively with them in the role of strategists and researchers, but they produced everything, and they're really a first-rate agency.
But Mr. Gorton mentioned that the ads that had been done in the Duma elections had been creative, but didn't have much of a point. Were there different people? Were these the same people or different people, or did you end up having any influence as far as using American-style imagery or anything else about the way that American consultants make commercials?
Actually, I think the influence that we had was to help them target their creative message to the problems that were facing the electorate. If you look at the commercials in the Duma elections, many of them were very, very well done. They just were completely off target. Our Home is Russia party, Chernomyrdin's party, ran commercials showing, healthy, wealthy, well-fed, well-dressed people all in Moscow. So if you're living out in Novosibirsk or Voronezh or someplace like that and you see this, you look at it and say, those are the crooks who are gaining by what's happening here while we're suffering.
Yes, and Yavlinsky, who might have been a very powerful candidate otherwise, seemed to have a penchant for creative but funny ads. And in the Duma, he ran ads that were Newton with apples falling on him, saying, "Oh, Yavlinsky has a better idea," and that was the main point. In the second, and in this election, I think he did similar silly things. He had half-naked men with bodybuilders, and it looked saying something about Yavlinsky being strong, and it just didn't go with the seriousness of the times. So we were able to do focus groups on the Video International ads and tell them which lines worked, which lines didn't. For instance, in some of their ads, they had lines talking about how good things were now. We found that ads that talked about how bad things were under the communists worked a hell of a lot better than ads that talked about good things now, because most people didn't think things were good now. So we were able to throw lines out for them, and we were able to throw some whole commercials out for them, and we were able to work with them, especially on their negative ads, in a way that I think softened them in some degree and I think made them more effective. But they get the credit.
George, it seems to me that Yavlinsky is young enough to have a second bite of the cherry in 10 years from now. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think Yavlinsky may be a coming candidate. Certainly I think right now Lebed is very, very strong. In our last poll, he was 64 positive and 14 negative in terms of his name ID. And of course, he's also very popular with most segments of the military. And I think Lebed would be the candidate to watch, and perhaps Chernomyrdin as a secondary candidate, and Yavlinsky third.
Yavlinsky is not going to get anywhere until he learns what campaigns are about.
I mean, I would just add one thing to that. I think a year in Russian history today is sort of like a generation. And I think if you go back, I was reading Daniel Yergin's book, Russia 2010, and you look at the names of the politicians who were prominent even 2 or 3 years ago, you say to yourself, gee, who are these people? So while certain people, whether it's Lebed or Yavlinsky, may be prominent today, a year from now they could be dismissed, unpopular, and gone.
The decision to bring Lebed on board the campaign or to utilize the Lebed campaign for Yeltsin's benefit, was that taken by you, or was that done by Yeltsin's Russian advisors? It was obviously an early stage of the campaign.
We didn't make any decisions. We made, when we were analyzing the impact of the third force based on the polling data, at least a month. Actually, it was late April and early May, because that was at the point that these candidates issued a statement that on May 20th they were going to coalesce behind one candidate. And what we wrote in our memos was that a united third force could be very dangerous, and the campaign should do everything it could to prevent that from happening. And secondly, if you did have a united third force, the most dangerous candidate would be Lebed. And we advised them that they should work to keep either all three in the race or cut a deal with them, and particularly Lebed, as soon as possible, and that it was worth paying a serious price for it.
Both before and after, we had recommended that Levitt's support was very important for the president.
Yeah.
What impact do you think Yeltsin's reelection will have on the U.S. campaign this fall, and how do you feel that in light of Mr. Dresner's relationship with Mr. Morris and Mr. Gorton's comment in today's L.A. Times that Mr. Yeltsin was a more responsive client than Pete Wilson?
Yeah. Well, if you knew Pete, you wouldn't have any trouble understanding that. You know, one of the interesting things was that reporters in Moscow, American reporters, were asking on the streets if the vote in Moscow in Russia was a vote for or against America. And I'd have to say that the vote in Russia had absolutely nothing to do with America. I mean, there's a country with very serious problems that had all to do with Russia. And I think the same thing is going to be true here in America. I mean, our problems aren't anywhere near as serious, but, you know, American elections are rarely settled on foreign policy, and certainly, even though if the truth be known, probably this is an extraordinarily important thing to not only America but the rest of the world, I don't think it'll impact American elections very much at all. Yes, ma'am.
Paid for your bills, and who got you set up at the President Hotel?
Well, the President Hotel was the campaign headquarters for the entire campaign. We were on the 11th floor with Tatiana Dyachenko Yeltsin, and we were the only two. We had the two offices there. We walked back and forth and shared secretaries, we shared translators, we shared Xerox machines and fax machines. The rest of the campaign was on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floor. So it's my assumption the campaign paid for all the offices, paid for all the equipment and everything. But, you know, we don't see any of the money. We don't know whence or where it came from. The reason I point that out is because it seems like there's a law in Russia, near as we can tell, that there's a $3 million spending limit. And we're not sure which of the candidates, if any, lived up to it. So,
Who hired you?
well, we were hired, we were brought over by Felix Brainin, who was a Russian-American businessman from San Francisco, and the actual words, "you're hired," were spoken by First Deputy Prime Minister Oleg Soskovitz, who was in charge of handling the campaign at that time. He was in charge of the campaign. But we met with any number of people on the way.
I assume that Soskovitz paid for the bills, or?
Yeah.
For the campaign? Somebody. I mean, we couldn't prove to you. Oh, I'm sorry. We couldn't, you know, really tell you accurately who paid or who didn't pay, and realize that when Soskovitz hired us, I think within a month he was no longer involved with the campaign. So.
Yes.
Did your own individual budget exceed the $3 million?
You know, this is the first campaign since the 1972 Nixon campaign that I worked on, where we had essentially an unlimited budget. We were told to do whatever we thought we needed to do, and we hired 3 different polling companies, which we went out and hired ourselves because we wanted to make sure that we believed in the polling companies. We told them that we were told that we couldn't tell them we worked for the Yeltsin campaign. So we told them that we were American, we represented an American company that wanted to sell thin screen TVs in Russia. And it was a fiction that we kept up almost till the end, and the polling companies saw through it probably a month out. It just got to be too ridiculous. And we did 2 polls a week, which was really fun. So we actually, there's an internet story in it. The only way we could have done this was the polling agency gave us the data on the disk, and then we emailed it to Dick's computer in New York. They massaged it and weighted it and put it into the format that we're used to, emailed it back to us, and then we got our printouts. We also did 40 to 50 focus groups in all parts of European Russia. We never got the strength and courage to go to Asian Russia because it was just too far away. Russia is 11 time zones. So we have this wealth of knowledge of what Russia is like and what people are thinking. We went to villages as small as one that was 21 homes. We went to places that were completely out of the way, places that have been closed cities, places that don't ever see any strangers, much less foreigners. And by the way, we're going to make that information available probably to a library or university someday very soon. And it's going to be a real wealth of information that I don't think anybody else in the world has on Russia.
So does that mean practically unlimited budget mean yes, that it was more than the...
The answer is no, it wasn't anywhere close. It was the $3 million limit you're talking about, I assume.
Yeah.
Right.
Did you run into any resentment as outsiders in Russia?
Yeah, two kinds. One internally from the campaign. We were accused of being involved with the CIA, which we were not. In fact, the American Embassy, to our knowledge, didn't even know we were there. And there was other things. In fact, we started out for the first half of the campaign, our memos said our names on them, and then after that, Tatiana asked us to put just "to you from us." So we put just "to you from us" to avoid that. And then we had one interesting situation in the town of Perm. Alan Brannon, we arrived and tried to check into the hotel, and it turned out that he didn't have a stamp which from the hotel the night before, which meant that for one day he was unaccounted for in Russia. And this so upset the hotel clerk that she called the Oblast police, and they called the airport and fixed it so that we would not be allowed to leave Perm until he got a stamp. And Catch-22, you could only get the stamp in Moscow. We were stuck in Perm, Russia.
There was a little bit that I just saw. One funny story, we're doing a focus group in one of the outlying towns, and the moderator came out to come in the room we were reserving it on, and the people were talking. They started, well, who do you think they're working for? And they went through 3 or 4 ideas, and then some, I know who they're working for. They're working for the Americans. It was really funny.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about the focus groups? Was there any difference between how you would do it here and how you did it there?
Why don't you, I'll start. I think all of us have some strong feelings in here. First, in the initial focus groups, there was tremendous difference because the Russians' approach is very, very academic, and our approach was very, very political, and we had a hard time convincing them they had to be direct and ask the kind of questions we wanted. So we could figure out strategy and recommendations. The first group we went to, we had this big fight with the moderator. He was saying things like, if Yeltsin was a tree, what kind of tree would he be? If Yeltsin was an animal, what kind of animal would he be? And we would want him to ask things like, do you think Yeltsin should be reelected, and if not, why? And so that was the initial part, just getting them to in step with doing the kind of stuff we felt was strongly needed. Second thing that I think was that the focus groups were tremendously important in 2 ways. They educated us about Russia in a way that nothing else could have done and made us effective. And secondly, they provided us the information and backup to put weight and behind our recommendations and help persuade. And I know these guys have lots of stories about them.
I think, too, I remember one occasion we came back to Moscow, and they said to us, well, you've been to the parts of Russia that most Russians don't see. And we felt like saying, well, actually, we're now in Moscow in the part of Russia that most Russians never see. I think the thing that amazed me was that the people in the focus groups were brutally honest. They would say anything that came to their mind. They'd call Yeltsin a murderer. They'd call the communist monsters. They would say things like, well, so-and-so did something, he ought to be shot. They pulled no punches whatsoever, and in a sense, they were more accurate than the polling. But again, both in the polling and in the focus groups, when we got there, it's not that the Russians don't know how to do research, it's that they would do psychological and sociological research and not political research. And one of the things that amazed me in the polls is that we had many polls in the past made available to us, and much of this information is off the internet. You can't find before March of this year a Russian poll that asked, what's your opinion of Boris Yeltsin? Or what kind of job do you think so-and-so is doing as, Yeltsin is president or so-and-so is minister of defense, or things like that. Or how would it impact on your vote if the administration gave everybody their back pay? Their questions were very indirect. They felt that by asking direct questions, you were biasing everything and putting yourself in the process.
Another thing the focus groups did for us was tell us about the tremendous difference between rural and urban Russia. I mean, there is far more difference between Malakava and Moscow than there is between Peoria and New York. You know, Malakava has no phones. It has 4 or 5 cars. It's 100 miles from the nearest town. And it has no running water except for 1 pump for the village. And it has no toilets. And so, I mean, that's a huge difference from Moscow. And it's a certain sort of isolation in terms of information. They have this funny little box in their room called a TV, and it brings them the Mary Tyler Moore show. And they've never seen a woman with a haircut like Mary Tyler Moore, and they've never seen a building that's 3 stories tall. And so there's a huge difference between Malakava and Moscow. And there's a huge difference between the people. One of the things that happened to us is, early on, the president was talking about land reform. And so we were going, great, we need land reform because we're doing so badly in the rural areas. So we urged him to do this with memos, and whether he was going to do it or not, who knows. But anyway, he did it, so we were thrilled. And then our next poll came in, and we had actually gone down in the rural areas. So we went out and did this focus group in a little village and to find out what was going on. And to hear the people talk, our moderator said, well, you know, you got land, your land is given to you. You know, isn't this great? And the answer is, wait a minute. No, it's not great. First of all, there's tons of free land around here. As you fly across Russia, you can see they're so underutilizing their land. It's amazing. And second of all, before we got a check. You know, now we got to check whether we cut the wheat or we didn't cut the wheat. You know, now we have to cut the wheat, and we give it to this guy who's a truck driver. He takes it away. He sells it. He doesn't give us the money. There's no distribution system. So, you know, Moscow was the land of where the checks came from before, and now it's not the land the checks came from, and so that was a problem for them. And that was just one of the things focus groups did for us, is explain to us why some things that we thought would be wonderful ideas were really not.
You mentioned that you have a pretty good expense account for doing all the projects and so forth. Who paid your salaries, you three?
We got our salaries from a bank that was that the money was transferred through, and we don't know. We assume it came from the campaign.
Which bank?
Well, you know what? We're not going to go into that.
Who made the arrangements when you traveled in the rural areas or formerly closed cities, or who would get you in there?
Alan Brainin.
Yeah,
He
I mean,
spoke Russian, and
Alan, working with the 2 Russian secretaries who we shared with the president's daughter, basically, so that they would make the logistic arrangements. We were not very good at it, simply because of a language problem.
How do you spell his name?
B-R-A-Y?
B-R-A-Y-N-I-N.
A-L-L-E-N or?
Yes. I think.
I hope. Yes.
What do you think of Yeltsin's health?
I have no secret knowledge or insight, especially on that, except that at the end of the campaign, when the problem came up, I saw the president's daughter in the hallway and the offices, and she did not appear stressed out as if he was had serious health problems or in danger of dying, and that made me feel a lot better at that time.
Yeah.
I'm a bit confused. I want to get one thing straight in my mind. You aren't quite sure who exactly approved and hired you for this whole thing, and you don't know who actually paid you?
We know who hired us. It was Oleg Soskovitz.
Who was head of the campaign,
At
and
that
also
time.
first deputy prime minister.
And we know what bank gave us the money. Can we tell you for sure who gave the bank the money and where it came from? No. And I think that would be true of just about everything that took place in the campaign. There must have been, when you look at the television advertising, there must have been 5 or 10 independent groups who were funneling money to have the commercials run or to have public service announcements run. So we don't really have knowledge of it.
When we got there were 11 registered groups supporting. Yeah. When we got there were 11 registered groups supporting Boris Yeltsin. And one of the first tasks and one of the first things that Tatiana had to do was figure out how to consolidate these. And the moment that we were plucked out of the Soskovitz group and made advisors to her, she said, you know, I don't know what we're going to do with all these groups, but we want you to be advisors to the family. So that was really a key moment for us in took us out of the intrigue and out of the back and forth between the organizations and operations, so it was great.
What was your collective fee for this period of time?
You know, we've decided not to say that too. Sorry.
How do you see the role that you played there? I mean, the Time, I think, headline was that you saved Yeltsin. I mean, how significant do you think your role was?
Well, I think our role was probably more significant in this campaign than any campaign I've been involved in. And I've been involved in campaigns for 25 years. And it's hard to assess in any given time. But in any given campaign, you know, who provided what and what have you. But I would say more significant than any campaign I've been involved in.
Well, I don't know what other campaigns you've been involved in, so I can't judge. I mean,
The way I'd put it is, I think we played a significant role. You had, and I wouldn't say I wouldn't want to come to the conclusion that we played the most significant role, the least, or the most role I've ever played in a campaign necessarily. But I'd point out to you that Time magazine, independently over a 4-week span, came to a conclusion that gave us a pretty substantial impact on the campaign, as did ABC, and even the Washington Post, to whom we never talked. Came to the conclusion on Sunday that it was one of the 3 or 4 reasons why Yeltsin won. So I would come to the conclusion that we played a very significant role.
Is there any concern in the Yeltsin campaign over the fact that you were going public with this thing? I would think this might not have such a great effect in Moscow as it might have here. For you, I guess it's going to be a boon, but...
Well, there was a lot of nervousness, you know. In the last 2 weeks of the campaign, Grachev, the defense minister, was fired. 7 generals were fired. Chubais seemed immediately to be victorious, and then it was announced that he would not be allowed back in the Yeltsin administration. Korzhakov, who is the presidential security advisor, or more than advisor, director, was fired. Bursakov, the head of the successor of the KGB, was fired. And Soskovitz, the first deputy prime minister, who was thought to be going to be the next prime minister, was fired. So there was a lot of intrigue and fear and what have you. Tatiana originally agreed to do an interview with Time magazine, and then then we got the word back that she was sick. So, you know, we had informed them that this was happening. So we got no statement from them that this was not to do it. And of course, we couldn't not do it anyway because, in point of fact, we'd been found, and we made the arrangement with Time magazine and actually with several other newspapers that if they didn't write a thing before the election, that we would give them some special stuff after the election. We had to do that, frankly, with the Sacramento Bee, who caught us. Yeah.
Did you pick up any ideas or learn any lessons that you might think about applying to American elections?
Go ahead.
I really don't have an answer of techniques I would apply to the American language. I mean, the stuff that I really learned was about Russia and the Russian people and not directly translatable. Maybe these 2 guys will have a better answer.
I've decided that in the next major election we work on, we're going to demand that the press support us completely from beginning to end. I think that really it's the Russian culture, and if I've learned anything is that the cultures are just so dramatically different that it's very difficult to apply too much from one to the other.
I mean, one totally striking difference in why things don't necessarily translate from technique or philosophy. In Russia, my view was I came to believe that we're in America where there's a problem, people want it solved and things to change. In Russia, they want to keep it the same because it might get worse. And that was a totally different philosophy.
Yeah, go ahead.
Washington Post wrote that your group was top secret. Was it true?
Yeah, absolutely. Top secret. Well, first of all, it was so secret that they made it clear that they would be happier if we never left the hotel. They gave us rooms to sleep in on the same floor as our office, and they gave us 2 armed guards and a former KGB driver to take us around. The general thought was, or what they expressed to us, was 2. One, the first thought was that that this would be playing into the communist hands and they would be able to say that Yeltsin was a tool of the Americans. And the second one was that there's so much intrigue in this campaign that we need to separate you from that and keep you up and above and out of it.
I happened to be in Moscow when the Washington Post story hit the street and had the great pleasure of informing the campaign that it existed, and I think they were somewhat upset and freaked out that this story had actually appeared before the election. And I think had there been something else, they really would have gotten excited. It was fundamental to them that the Americans were not helping. And in fact, in the Washington Post story, if you remember, a campaign spokesman said that is totally, completely untrue. No Americans exist.
He said it was a bunch of damned lies.
Yeah.
Oh, I think in the BBC story, which came out before the election, they went around talking to various campaign officials and asking that question over and over, and the first 6 or 7 people, including people like Satterhoff and Filatov and so on, denied that there was any Americans ever involved in the campaign. And then the last 2 people they spoke to, one of whose names I can't remember, said, well, they were there, but they provided technical advice. And then they got to the ad agency, and they said, well, they provided some very valuable advice to us. So they were very concerned, and I'd add a third reason why I was concerned, and that is that they were concerned about our safety, and to some extent so were we.
What's your personal attitude to that problem? I mean, from the point of view maybe of morality or social responsibility. The campaign, the Yeltsin campaign, lied to their voters about your presence there.
Well, I think that one of the things that people said in focus groups, I think you have to keep your eye on the larger picture here. The real issue here was whether Russia would turn towards democracy or turn back towards a totalitarian system, and I want to separate the economic from the political. I think they did a lot of things that, if you go back in American history, you'd see were done in places like Chicago and so on. But given what was at stake, those are really minor details. And to me, you know, I'm very proud that I had something to do with helping democracy take root in Russia.
Fundamentally, the issue was if we had been rejected in campaign, it would have been a phony issue. I mean, there was much more at stake and far more important issues than that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dressler there, and the rest is George Clinton. Thank you.
This weekend, on America and the Courts, commencement speeches to the class of '96. At Liberty University, Justice Clarence Thomas, and Justice Stephen Breyer at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. California's First Lady Gail Wilson with a proposal aimed at preventing teen pregnancy. A critique of America's political system from Jerry